Okay. Hi, everybody. I am going to give you a little bit of a presentation. Of course, this doesn't want to work well for me, of course, because, technology is never what you want it to be. So I am going to do my best to make sure everybody sees what they need to see. All right. This is basically as a result of my rabbit hole that I went down. I've been in the SCA for 13 years about, and up until this point, I've done the common things, which I would say are England, Viking, 14th century England mainly. I love the fit of a cohort E. I've worn them for years, and even starting out in Brendoke, and I still have my first pattern from a cohort E. It really doesn't fit anymore, but it's the idea that that's where I started. My latest kind of rabbit hole comes from falling in love with the Netflix series with Sophia LaRousse. So I really fell in love with this series. It was in Russian, so of course there's the closed caption on it to an English translation. But the idea of how she went from an Italian background and changed her whole situation in life and went into a Russian environment during a time whenever the Mongolians were really really finally out of the way, and they could move ahead as a Russian nation, and they could do their own trade and things like that, which opened the floodgates to silk and some other things that happened. Is really interesting to me. So the period that I was really looking at was anywhere from like 12th to 14th to 15th century Russian. I did find, though, a lot of really splendid information that had to do with the 10th to the 13th century. And of course, I put the book down and I can't find it. Stepanova's book, let me turn to the next thing. I use a book called The Burial Dress of the Upper Volga. Here it is. The book looks something like this, okay? And it is a pretty pricey book. So if you really want this book, I would advise you to get a hold of a library at a university or something. This book was about 170 bucks. So it's pretty high whenever you think that I buy stuff as cheaply as I can, because I know that I want more than one book. But this book is actually has a lot of good information in it, and has a lot of firsthand information, meaning that it's not a summative book. It is actually a burial finding book with a lot of good firsthand drawings of burials and burrows of where people actually where their story is left or left for us to find. The other resources I have are Sophia LaRousse. If you don't know her, she is a Laurel, Russian Laurel, and I believe she comes from the Washington or Oregon area. And then Ivan Rosansky, and I think I have his name spelled wrong. Ivan Rosansky has a tremendous resource out on the web, and I'm always going up and finding his stuff. And for some reason, I always think that it's a new article, and then I get halfway through it and I think, oh no, I did read this, but this is really cool again. So I keep reading his stuff over and over again. So those are my main resources that I've used so far. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have like 300 or 400 pages of other stuff, but those are my main resources. So as I went through this book, I was truly enamored with the concept that your costume, your garb, your kit, all of those things is actually making up a story about you. And I know we take that like, oh, okay, yeah, it would. But the idea that the story that we have to find may not be complete. So in other words, some of the burrows were found with people who were very elegantly dressed. And some burrows were found with people that their garb was not even sewn together. Other ones were, they had part of their garb would have a temple ring and another one was missing. So by those things, we're like, okay, did somebody die too quickly that they couldn't even get their grave robes, their grave goods done? Did somebody keep a matching temple ring in order to remember that person, or did somebody give it to them as they went into life because they didn't have one? It also strikes me as because some of the garb that you have is, of course, if you make it period style, it takes a lot of work. So for you to put somebody in a full elegant garb would mean that, you know, you're willing to give up all that work and something that you wouldn't pass down to somebody else. So to me, there's an entire storyline that exists when you unearth someone, and I find that absolutely fascinating. And I put that into my own context, like, oh my gosh, you know what I mean? What does that mean for me? My my one thing I focused on was the headdresses. And one of the reasons I did that is, as you go through the book, the headdress was something that they could make, pass on, give to their kids, will to somebody. And you can actually, if you look at the birch bark findings that I have, you can actually recreate and make more elaborate headwear without ever getting rid of what started out. So if my mother started a headwear diadem, sorry, I could look at it and I could take it back off the setting, whatever I've used to set it, and I could add to it. And that to me is just fascinating, kind of like that hand-me-down wedding dress that you can kind of get. So that I thought was really, really fascinating. And I just took that to heart. The book itself, because it is so elaborate and actually well written, there are numerous pages, and I showed you one, but here's numerous pages on actual people who are buried in a burrow, and then they drew the person with the headwear that they have. They had jewelry, they had a lot of bells. Bells are all over the place. And some of this was silver, bronze. It could have been anything from jewels to platelets of copper. And it could have been cowrie bells or cowrie shells, or even bells. I mean, bells were so popular, which is crazy because I would think that, you know, that would be a really hard thing to make at that point in time. But they were very, very popular at that point in time. They would have had beads around their neck. And depending on who you were, you know, you could have had, there was anamorphic pins. Anamorphic being like a representation of a deer or a bear or something like that that acted as a kind of a brooch that they would use. So depending on what your character was, I mean, if you were older, they could bury you with more things, but there's some elderly people were buried and they really had barely anything. For a maybe teenage girl who was supposed to be married, they might put her in her wedding gown, and other ones they would not. So it really was a matter of situational character and story that was lying there in that burrow. And I think I take a lot of value on that. I think we all do, everyone we do in the SCA, but there's a lot of value in trying to figure out where you fit. And in these ways, it helped me think of my story and what I needed my persona to be, because I was seeing myself being there, seeing myself, you know, going through that process. What I wanted to do after I focused on timeline, or focused on what I wanted for my headwear, was to find something that I could make as flexible as possible. So I wanted to make sure that, you know, that the diadem there, or the headwear that I have on now, it can be used for Slavic, it can be used for Viking, it can be used for early Rus. So I wanted to make sure that this could be flexible. But if you look at the timeline that I have, and I'm sorry, I can't look at everything at once. So if you have, you know, a question, please speak up, because the screen is not letting me see your chat as well. But so if you look at this layout, the copper diadem is actually from about 6th to 13th, 14th century. So it really is something that is more flexible than probably all the other options I could have chosen. And seeing that I haven't found my landing spot to be absolute precise, I wanted to make sure this was going to be more for my buck. Okay. But as you can see, diadems sort of changed, or copper diadems sort of changed. There's some really fascinating, if you look at the middle, there's like a wider diadem in the front, it goes to a narrow port on the back, but there's a lot of decoration along the back. Okay. And this is like very, very cool. But on the other hand, I don't know how practical it was, because as I'm wearing mine now, which has some on the back, it constantly, you know, pulls on my linen, and I don't know how practical that was. But as you go down, there's more of the smaller pieces because in my mind, it's because you were able to get a smaller hole, which meant you could sew it on. I could be wrong, but I'm still learning. So I think that's the cool part about making summations and having, you know, more information prove you wrong, basically. So I wanted to make something that, first of all, was very, you know, flexible, and I could use it more than just once or twice. The findings themselves of the headwear are pretty, you know, cryptically drawn. The top one that you see is actually a basic representation of a copper headwear. The one to the left there is their representation of where a temple ring would be wrapped in hair. And that goes for the right one as well. And then the bottom one is just a simple like leather strap, basically, that they wore across their head. So what they were doing here was really trying to, you know, put into an artful way what they found exactly in that grave. And I noticed the top one does not have anything down the back. So really, to me, they were just trying to make sure that you saw the front of the item itself. So what I set out to do was to make one of these diadems, okay? And I needed more to go on. So all the books in the Stepanova book didn't have a back end view, and they didn't have a from the back view. So that meant that I didn't quite know how to construct the item. So I went and I found examples. This example is actually a Viking example from about the same region. So the Slavic, where you could arguably say they were started with the Vikings, with Rurik and his push down through those areas and coming south from would be Finland and up in that area. So arguably you could say it was kind of the same thing, but again, I wanted something that was really more versatile. And so I thought this would be a good place for me to research. One of the things I found on this was that if you look on the back area where you can see the back of one of these tiles or plates, is that there is kind of an envelope cut into it where they kind of pull together and hold together. That was one of my concerns, is like, okay, so I'm going to put this on my head, and if I just fold it like an envelope, is it going to pull my hair, or what's it going to do? And that was one of the things I chose to do, whether it was specific to early roofs or not, because I wanted it to maintain its form, and I wanted it to be a longer working product. Okay, and as you can see, this is the back, some back decorations and some plates that go on the bottom. And one of the things that's interesting is that just like the temple rings, the plates and the decorations on your hanging kind of lanyard, your copper lanyard back here, those would be different from village to village. So this is really kind of characteristic of anything we do now, kind of like, okay, this is my team, this is your team, this is how we say our name. It's just very, very individual for your culture. And so that was interesting as well. Okay. I also found a couple SEA examples, and this is actually the back of the copper diadem. But as you can see, there's a lot of weight here. So the back of the head, it's actually pulling down, and there's a lot of stress on there. The rope itself in both of these is, in the one that's in the museum, was actually red and blue wool that was actually pulled and knotted. So if you think about that, as you pull your rope around, it's going to go through the back and then knot on the other side. That's how you're going to get your tension. Okay. And as you can see, they finished it off with some copper coils. All right. I got 3 people in the chat. Let me look. Okay. So if you look, yes, and you're right. So it depends on who you talk to. So the question was the illustration of East Baltic, probably a galleon or solo. I'm sorry, I can't say the word. Both of which differ from the other tribes within Latvia. So what's the evidence for it being applicable to Rus? If you look at and you know, I know there's a lot of let's just say that the tribes in this upper Russian, you know, Poland area are, you can arguably say they came from a lot of different places. But the argument is that this is actually early Rus, which would have been, they're saying Rus is not really a word until probably the 13th, 14th century, whenever they started combining themselves as Russian within a political within a political aspect. So I think that's where they're going, but I could be wrong, and I can read it again and answer your question. But you know, as I'm going through here and I'm trying to figure out really where I want to pin myself down, you are correct. It is really hard to say that this is specifically this place and this time because of the movement, okay, of the movement of peoples and of people, what they believe in their words. So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I looked at this as what can I do that will represent either on whether I went to Finnish, Viking, or when I went to Russian, or whether I went Slavic, what can I do to make this look kind of like everything? So I hope that came out right. So, and this is, I'm just going to go through this really quick. I created rope because I thought that I wanted to be authentic. I worked with wool thread because I figured that would be the most period. And what I did was I just basically, you know, created long ropes, folded them in half, twisted, and then twisted them the opposite way when I put them together. I have found a better way to do this at this point. But for my first try at this, you can see that I was pretty uneven. And I definitely need to work on that if I do this again. Second thing I did was basically, I went and I created coils. I did a couple coils around a screwdriver. I did them by hand, but the reality is that, you know, my arthritis said, no, we're not going to do that. And it's just as easy, or easier rather, to put a screwdriver into a electric screw gun and then basically hold the wire and let it form itself. You just have to, either way, it's a little bit hard on your hands. I have to think though that because of the wide variety of this, there was some way to create that coil as it went across and wrapped around another rod. I have to believe that they did that. I just can't believe that they did all this by hand. But I don't know that that's around, right? I've not seen that. This really isn't that hard, and you can do a relatively, you know, big pile within a few minutes just by using that. One of the things that I ran into though is once you make like a 7 or 8 inch coil, it's really kind of hard to cut it down without compromising the ends. So if I was going to do it again, I'd probably mark where I wanted that coil to be and kind of only make it that long so that I didn't have to cut it and it didn't twerk the coil at the end and kind of interfere with the way it looked. All right, so looking at this again, there is a plate that has an envelope, and I have my coils. One of the things that I didn't think about in the beginning was that your coil opening has to be wider than your plate opening so that it doesn't push through. So as you make your plate and then your coil goes here, if your coil is smaller, it's going to go into underneath the plate. And so that's something to consider if you're ever going to do this. Since I didn't know what I was doing, I pretty much winged it. I measured my head and I pretty much said, I have 3 of these, or I have how many plates, and I have this big of a head and I have this much coil. And I really did do that. Now mine came out to where the coils are slightly smaller than what I saw on all of the examples. And that doesn't really rest well with me. I know it should be a little bit different, but the first try, I figure I'm kind of happy with it. What I would do next time is I would measure and I would make the coils the length, like I said, that they needed to be, and I would probably make them wider. Why I would do that is because I think that it would fit your head better, and it would actually be easier to thread. So as you put any kind of wool thread through here, especially the one I did, as you pull it through, it actually pulls on the thread and actually makes the thread a little bit, it frays the thread some. So when you get to the back, what you're doing is pulling that thread across those surface points and it to me, it degraded the integrity of the thread, okay, that I made, or the rope that I made. What I would also say is, what gauge wire? I used 18 gauge wire, just like this, 18 gauge dory wire. And as you can see, it's pretty pliable. They actually came out kind of like this. They do bend. There is some flexibility there. Now, period would be bronze, not copper, but I don't know how to anneal it. And this is my first try. So I figured this would be the easiest to screw up with, or the easiest to build my skills with. Okay. So this is what it basically is. Okay. And basically I just, like I said, I added it together and tried to make it work. For the plates, I literally cut a 3-inch. It was 3 inches long by 1.5 inches wide. We put a small hole in it for an envelope. And I used basically a piece of wood, and we folded it around there and we tucked it in, and that's how I made the plates. Okay. So this wasn't hard to do. It was easy to work with, as long as you can cut this and kind of sand it off a little bit. That's what I did. Okay. If you want to decorate these, I suggest you do that before you bend it. I didn't think about that, so none of mine are decorated, but definitely for any kind of period where the metalist or whoever would make it would probably have some kind of design here. So you would want to do that before you do that, before you put it all together. Okay. So for the back, I did not have the bronze again, but what I did was simply roll that around a couple times, depending on what you look at. Some of them there are a double coil, and then some of them are a single coil. So it depends on how you want to do that. If you look at the one in the middle, it looks like it's I'm gonna make it bigger. I think this is one of the single coil, but other things that I looked at from a PDF download of it, or other archaeological finds, in the finish, they were actually double. So it'll be 2 coils and then 2 coils, pulled in. And as you can see, this is a piece of the copper that we had marked out to make the lanyard ends on it, the flashing lanyard ends. And this is what we did on a die machine. And we had actually went to the neighbor who's a machinist, and he cut these for us. But you could do this on any kind of jigsaw or anything like that. The finished product that actually came out to look like this. Okay, this is one on my dress form, and it basically looks like this. As you can see, I didn't have a top plate on it because I didn't have the ability at the time to make that top center. I didn't have the right gauge copper. I did have a piece, but it didn't match the others, so I didn't want to make it too different. And these are about 12 inches long, the lanyard lines, and then at the end is a triangular piece of copper that basically has a few mark lines on it from a Dremel. Okay, again, looking back, I would practice on my Dremel, and I would make sure that these had some decor on them before I folded them, and especially the back one. Now, I know already there has been some pull and some settling on this. As you create it, the biggest part and the longest part was laying this flat and pulling enough with enough tension to create an upright product. That took the longest amount of time, but it is very flexible, and it is copper. So whenever I store it in a box with a round piece of foam. I put it down in the box, and I make sure that it retains its form. It makes it easier, and I feel better. Yeah, it's just me. I also store it with a piece of it's supposed to create an environment where it doesn't get patina on it. So I have one of these, and with it, I have it in that box. All in all, I am happy with it. I would say that it works for what I wanted it to work for. I learned what I wanted to learn. I would definitely want one that is more of a bronze, but I do have to learn some skills in order to make that happen. But again, for my first try, I'm pretty happy with it. I do have one more to cover, but I wanted to make sure that I was answering questions. Do you have any questions?
I do.
Go ahead.
What is the black stuff that you used to stop the patina on the copper?
You know what it is? I can look it up. It's I bought it off of Amazon. I just basically said, you know, copper deterioration, and this is what you put in with any jewelry that's copper jewelry. So I have one of these in with my Viking jewelry that is also kind of a copper bronze material, and so far it's worked pretty well. I can look it up, but I forget what it was. I just found it on Amazon. I'm sorry.
That is fine. I was just curious.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I will, if I teach this again, I'll make sure I write it down. Okay. So the second one I made is actually, you know, pretty simple. I know it doesn't look like it's simple, but it is pretty simple. I wanted to create a birch bark diadem, which if you look at this is the bottom lower right. Okay, so this lady that's here, she actually has a birch bark diadem on. Go ahead. Okay, it's just somebody in the background. Okay, so what I wanted to make was this young lady right here, and if this is the artist's rendition or the burial's rendition, and what she's wearing is a birch bark diadem with silk on the front, and she actually has cowrie shells on it. I didn't necessarily want cowrie shells, but I wanted to be able to have something that was a little bit more than this, more dressed than this, a little bit later century or later in period, so that I could go into that Ruth persona if I wanted to. And just by happenstance, my husband happened to have 4 logs of birch bark in our backyard. So I was like, hey, I need a bunch of birch bark. So he came in and pulled me off what is this kind of birch bark. That's how it comes off. It really just peels off like paper. And if you've read anything about Novro, they actually use this for paper, and they have little kids homework on it and some artists and some things on it. They also have like a couple hundred pieces of birch bark with business transactions on it. So this is actually, it was actually pretty easy to use. I would tell you if you're going to use birch bark, when you take it off, it wraps around the tree like this, but when you take it off, it actually inverts. Don't flatten it because it actually will help you to put it on your head. I also only had a piece of birch bark this big, okay? So it didn't quite fit around my head. It kind of, there's probably about 4 or 5 inch gap back there. So I think the bigger the birch bark piece, the more you'd be able to work with a more cohesive band. But I had an opening back there. I didn't want to sew it. I wanted it to be a kind of just like a piece of birch bark. So that's what I used. And I just basically, I'll be honest with you, I winged it. So what I did was I started by cutting the birch bark. I had probably about 20 inches back here, 18 to 20 inches, and I sliced off probably about 3.5 inches wide, and I used that. Now, as you can see, there's plenty of other birch bark here, but I don't know that it would do anything as far as going the whole way around your head. There are, if you look at that back piece, if you look at the girl in the middle on the bottom, that thing on the front of her head is also birch bark. So they did use birch bark to get that height. They also could have used birch bark and then the bronze on the top to make a plate. I did think about doing that, but there isn't a lot of evidence of what was on that plate. What was it punched? Was it, you know, etched? Was it, you know, jeweled? It's just really not a lot of evidence. So I didn't want to kind of take that big of a leap. So I cut the birch bark and literally put it aside, and I made a silk cover. I have some green silk at home. I made, what I did was just line up, make a couple lines, and I wanted some movement. I created over 100 of these little items that are on a jump ring, and then I took, you know, a pearl that is common for the area. It's a freshwater pearl, and I just made it dangly, and I wanted it to be able to move. So I made 100 of those. I definitely overproduced those, and I lined them up and put them onto this product. I was very happy with it because it was just so simple to flip that upside down, tack in the silk, and then I literally sewed the ends. I mean, it was very, very easy. Now, as I said, okay, let me see. Okay, I see your comment. Thank you. So what I did was basically, I tied the ends and I made the ends so that they came down to like a point. And basically this is the product, but as you wear it, it definitely has a lot of movement. And again, if this were damaged in any way, you could take it off, pull the stitches out, take it off, put it on a more stiff piece of birch bark or a new piece of birch bark. I know Valia uses leather in hers. She finds that works easier. And I might go to leather because birch bark is not readily available all the time. Okay. Okay. Let me go back. Okay. So this is how it came out. I did have this at TOA, Tournament of Arts, last year. And I also showed it at Crown in the fall. And when you put it all together, this is kind of what it looks like. So I have basically, a Russian kind of tunic on with the settings. And then I have a silk scarf and my diadem on. I really am happy at the way this all came out. But it's not the end of the kit, right? So one of the things I haven't done yet is purchase the temple rings, and that's a big part of the kit, but temple rings can have a broad application too. I did come up with some information on the fact that the temple rings are somewhat area specific, and then you could go on the other side and say they're not. My concern is in asking for advice on my persona and any kind of, trying to make sure that I am period specific and I am representing well, is that I would need to pick a really specific spot and then really perfect that. So I'm not sure where I'm going to land. So whether you have a basic ring or you have a ring with would be knotted work on it, or whether you have not an anamorphic ring, but they have like, it looks like a sunset. I forget the word, I'm sorry. But those are region specific if you ask some people. So I'm still not willing to invest, $100 in a pair of temple rings that are not going to be what I need in the end. I have invested in the copper cuffs, and I like those a lot. The copper cuffs are useful in trying to hold up your sleeves. So if you talk to some people, they're long sleeves or period. That was a very practical thing, but I have not invested in the temple rings because I want to make sure that I'm buying good quality because I'm not going to make them myself. Next time, of course, I would do bronze versus copper. I think that is really important to the longevity of the product. This is probably going to last me for a while, but 5-10 years from now, I'm definitely going to I want to move to bronze. I want to understand the process more because as you understand it, you realize the mistakes you made, and I'm sure that's very period, no matter what you do, and learning what you're doing. Obviously, I said I'd use better rope, different manufacturing type of rope. Yes, those were shiny cuffs. Those are, yep. Yeah. So I bought those through an Etsy supplier. And I don't have them right here at the table, but I bought them from an Etsy supplier. But yeah, I really like them. So I would actually use a different rope process so that it was tighter, where instead of just spinning the rope, you spin it and you let it create its own rope. So you end up doing twice as much. Anyway, so then there's that. And I would actually do the math before I did any of the cutting. And again, I'm going to do more for the kit, but I would actually invest in good temple rings. There's a couple comments here. Being period specific is not thing as being geographically specific. If you need more, says yes, and that anything helping would be great. And I can tell you that, as you jump down a rabbit hole, don't be afraid to say, I am like so confused, because one of the things I found out is you could read one person's idea of how this worked and another person's idea of how this worked. And reality of it is there is a lot of movement of people from in this entire region, right? One of the things I wish that I knew more about was the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians were actually in this place, but they actually weren't, and things are called something different. So if you read about Sarmatians, which I have a small book on them, they're actually period specific to the end of the Roman rule, but at the same time, they were living in a place that was named 4 different things. So they're actually in this group because they actually died out, and you know, they were pulled into the Slavic construct, but it's just so confusing. You know what I mean? I think that it would take me another good 5 to 10 years to have a real understanding of the ebb and flow of people and the ebb and flow of their how they became what do you want to say, you know, involved or enmeshed into cultures. I think we see this all through period. We see it now. You know, like Mexican food is Americanized, but you know, Mexican food in Mexico is not the same thing, but we think we're eating Mexican food, but it's the same kind of thing, right? But there's also, because if I understand it right, after the, what is it, 1270, which was around when the Mongols took over and kind of walled off Russia, to like around that 1400 period, there's a Mongol influx of culture and experiences and things like that. So after the Mongols went, then all of a sudden we see all of this stuff coming up from what would be Istanbul, Constantinople, whatever you want to call it. But all of a sudden, then they had a flourishing change. But keep in mind, what we see is not necessarily representing all the people. So I could go and I could look at this burial and I could say, this is what I want. But the reality of it is that, you know, fashions, because you had the ability to get to a product, did not necessarily mean that everybody in the social strata had the same product. So it's like I said, there was somebody who was buried, you know, without their clothes basically sewn. Other people were buried, you know, posthumously, or how you want to say that. So it's interesting to see, you know, even as you read and read and read and read, that, you know, culture comes from the top down in many cases. A lot of times, you know, even as if you look at was it 988 that they were the entire Russian group was changed to Christianity, that didn't flow down through the people as fast as it did the top layer, because basically the top layer of people were benefiting from being Christians because now they could do business with other Christians, right? So that didn't necessarily fall through. And as you read through this book and a lot of other books that are basically papers that I've brought down, there is evidence that, you know, the lower strata of people held on to their pre-Christian beliefs a lot longer than we would want to think, where 988 was where the whole country went to a Christian status. So it's interesting to see, you know, what they were buried with and what they weren't buried with, but also understand that this is a story. Like if I was buried in this, people would be like, oh my God, what does that mean? And that's really what some of this book goes over. So I still am in the rabbit hole, definitely in the rabbit hole. And I think that as I grow in more and I have more emphasis from the lower level, I want to pin down what I really want to do, and I want to know it. So there's a question over on the top about, you know, this may not mean this, or this may apply only to these people. You know, one of the first arguments I heard was that, you know, if you say you're Finno-Viking or whatever the word is, I'm sorry, but there's a Viking, Finnish Viking, that doesn't necessarily mean that what you have on you doesn't match another region of influence. But it also means, like I said, that some regions had certain markings or abilities that other regions didn't. Doesn't mean that they couldn't have done it. So there's a lot going on in that area, and it's very fascinating. And, you know, when you pull it all back to, you know, how did Princess Sophia Pavlogonia make it to Russia in the 13th or 14th century? How did that all come about? And then in the middle, I started, just like I said, finding this rabbit hole and being really interested in that. I really want to go down the St. Olga venue too. I want to learn a little bit more about her. She seems like a pretty fierce lady. But I also have to keep in mind that where you see illustrations of these folks in that time period, that doesn't mean that that's what they wore every day, or that's what every strata of social strata looks like. In fact, when I first came into the SCA, I was wondering why people changed into court garb. I'm like, why are you in court garb? Well, the reality was that you did have different garbs. So now I understand. And I'm not saying that I do that yet, but that's definitely a cool way of knowing and assimilating yourself into, this is what I would wear every day. This is what I would wear to court. And so that's kind of where I went with, this is what I would wear every day, and this is what I would wear to court. So I enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it. And there's a lot more to this. So I can't say that I represent everything, because I learn more every day. And I think that's the key to it. We learn more every day. And I learned from doing, and showing you this. I hope that you're learning too. All right. Do you have any questions? Is there anything else in the chat? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.